History, as we've been taught to understand it, moves in a single direction. From primitive beginnings, humanity has supposedly climbed an unbroken ladder toward greater complexity, sophistication, and enlightenment. We imagine ourselves at the apex of this progression, looking back at our ancestors with a mixture of admiration and superiority. But what if this comfortable narrative obscures a more profound and unsettling truth? What if the story of human civilization is not a straight line at all, but rather an endlessly turning wheel, repeating patterns that our ancestors recognized but we have forgotten? Tonight, we embark on a philosophical and historical exploration that challenges everything we think we know about the passage of time, the rise and fall of civilizations, and the very nature of human progress itself. Before we begin this journey through the ages, I'd like to ask something of you. If you find value in these explorations of our forgotten past, if these narratives help you see history in a new light or simply help you drift into peaceful sleep, please consider subscribing to this channel and leaving a like on this video. Your support helps us continue creating these deep dives into the mysteries of human civilization. It means the world to us, and it ensures we can keep bringing you these stories that connect us to our ancestors and to the great cycles of time itself. Now settle in. Let yourself relax completely. What follows is a story that spans tens of thousands of years, crossing continents and cultures, weaving together archaeology, astronomy, mythology, and philosophy. It begins with an ancient clay tablet discovered in the ruins of Mesopotamia, a document that would force us to reconsider everything we thought we knew about the earliest days of recorded history. This is the story of how the ancients viewed time not as a river flowing in one direction, but as an ocean with tides that rise and fall, advance and retreat, in patterns so vast they dwarf individual human lifespans. This is the story of the eternal wheel. In the early decades of the 20th century, archaeologists working in what was once ancient Mesopotamia made a discovery that would puzzle and fascinate scholars for generations. Among the ruins of the city of Nippur, they unearthed a series of clay tablets inscribed with cuneiform script. These were not religious texts or epic poems, but something more prosaic and yet somehow more mysterious: a list of kings. This document, which came to be known as the Sumerian King List, purported to chronicle the rulers of the ancient city-states of Sumer from the very beginning of civilization itself until the early second millennium before the Common Era. The most famous version of this list, recorded on what is now called the Weld-Blundell prism, is a clay object about 8 inches tall and 3.5 inches wide, inscribed on all 4 sides with 2 columns of text. The scribe who created it even left his name for posterity, Ner-Ninsaber. Dating to approximately 2,100 years before the Common Era, this prism and its companion texts present a chronological framework that is both tantalizingly historical and deeply mythological. What makes the Sumerian King List so extraordinary is not simply that it attempts to catalog ancient rulers, but how it divides history into 2 distinct epochs separated by a single cataclysmic event. The list begins with a section describing 8 legendary kings who ruled 5 antediluvian cities. These kings, according to the text, reigned for periods of time that seem to mock human comprehension. Alyalim of Eridu, the first king, is said to have ruled for 28,800 years. His successor Alalgar reigned for 36,000 years. These impossibly long reigns continue through 8 kings who collectively ruled for 241,200 years before disaster struck. Then comes the pivotal line that divides all of ancient history: the flood swept over. With these 4 words, everything changes. After this great deluge, the text tells us, kingship descended from heaven once more, this time to the city of Kish. But the kings who ruled after the flood had much more reasonable reign lengths. While some still enjoyed long lives by modern standards, ruling for 400, 600, or 900 years, these figures pale in comparison to the tens of thousands of years attributed to their antediluvian predecessors. Modern scholars have devoted enormous energy to understanding what the Sumerian King List represents. Is it pure mythology, a creation story wrapped in the form of a historical chronicle? Is it a distorted memory of actual rulers whose reign lengths were somehow corrupted in transmission across countless generations? Or might it encode something else entirely, a different way of measuring time that we no longer understand? Research by scholar E. Samuel Chen has revealed that the flood narrative was likely added to the king list during the Old Babylonian period, sometime between the 19th and 16th centuries before the Common Era. The earliest versions of the list, dating to the UR3 period around 2,100 years before the Common Era, may not have included the antediluvian section at all. This suggests that the concept of a great flood serving as a watershed moment in human history was a relatively late addition to Mesopotamian historiography, emerging only in the second millennium before the Common Era. Yet this does not diminish the significance of the flood motif's appearance. The fact that scribes felt compelled to divide history into pre-flood and post-flood eras tells us something profound about how they understood time and the human experience. The flood represented not just a physical catastrophe, but a rupture in the fabric of existence itself, a moment when one world ended and another began. Archaeological evidence lends some credence to the idea that massive floods were a recurring feature of life in ancient Mesopotamia. Excavations at the ancient city of Shuruppak, modern Tel Farah in Iraq, revealed a layer of alluvial sand and clay about 2 feet thick separating the earlier Jemdet Nasr period from the early dynastic layers above. This flood layer has been radiocarbon dated to approximately 2,900 years before the Common Era. Similar flood deposits have been found at other sites including Uruk and Kish, though they date to different periods, suggesting that catastrophic flooding was a regular occurrence in the Tigris-Euphrates river system due to the natural process of river avulsion. The geography of Mesopotamia made it particularly vulnerable to such disasters. The land between the rivers was essentially a flat alluvial plain, and for the people who lived there, a valley-wide inundation could indeed destroy the whole world as they knew it. The Persian Gulf sea levels rose dramatically following the last glacial period, fundamentally changing the coastal geography and potentially displacing coastal populations. But the Sumerian king list does more than simply record a flood. It establishes a pattern that would echo through human civilization for millennia to come, the idea that time moves in cycles, that golden ages give way to darker times, and that catastrophe can reset the human story, forcing survivors to begin again. The antediluvian kings, with their impossibly long reigns, represent a kind of golden age, a time when the world was fundamentally different, when the rules governing human life were not yet set in stone. The flood marks the end of that age and the beginning of something new, something more familiar and yet also diminished. This pattern, this sense of a catastrophic rupture dividing a mythical past from the historical present, is not unique to Mesopotamia. It appears in cultures separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years, suggesting either a common origin or a common human response to similar experiences of catastrophe and renewal. The Sumerian king list may be one of the oldest written expressions of this pattern, but it is far from the only one. Within the Sumerian literary tradition itself, the flood story is elaborated in other texts. The Eridu Genesis, a fragmentary tablet dating to the 17th century before the Common Era, provides more detail about the flood and its hero. In this version, a king named Zayisadra, ruler of the city of Shuruppak, receives warning from the god Enki about the coming deluge. The text describes how Zayisadra builds a great boat and survives 7 days and 7 nights of storms. When the flood subsides, he makes offerings to the sun god Utu and is granted eternal life, dwelling thereafter in the mythical land of Dilmun, where the sun rises. This same story appears in later Akkadian versions with the hero's name changed to Atrahasis or Utnapishtim. The Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the greatest literary achievements of the ancient world, incorporates the flood narrative when the hero Gilgamesh seeks out Utnapishtim, the survivor of the deluge, to learn the secret of immortality. These stories, woven into the fabric of Mesopotamian literature, reinforce the idea that humanity's story was marked by a great divide, a catastrophic event that separated one age from another. The significance of the Sumerian king list extends beyond its historical or mythological content. It represents one of humanity's earliest attempts to create a systematic chronology, to impose order on the chaos of the past. The fact that this chronology is structured around the concept of a great cycle, with the flood serving as both an ending and a beginning, reveals something fundamental about how the ancient Mesopotamians understood their place in time. They did not see themselves as climbing steadily upward from primitive origins. Instead, they believed they were living in a post-catastrophic age, inheritors of a broken world that had once been greater. The kings of their own time could not match the extraordinary longevity of their antediluvian predecessors, just as human beings in general had become smaller, weaker, more limited. This was not progress but decline, not evolution but devolution from a lost golden age. This understanding of history as cyclical rather than linear, as characterized by catastrophic breaks and new beginnings rather than steady advancement, would prove to be remarkably persistent across human cultures. The Sumerian king list, with its stark division of time into before and after the flood, established a template that would be repeated, elaborated, and reimagined by civilization after civilization, from the biblical authors who crafted the story of Noah to the Hindu philosophers who conceived of vast cosmic cycles called Yugas. The wheel of time had begun to turn in human consciousness, and it would continue turning through all the ages to come, carrying civilizations up to great heights and then dashing them down again, in an endless rhythm as old as the stars themselves. The story told in the Sumerian king list is not an isolated tale. Across the world, separated by vast oceans and millennia of cultural development, human societies have preserved remarkably similar stories of a great flood that destroyed the world, leaving only a small remnant of survivors to begin civilization anew. These flood myths, as they are known to scholars, appear in nearly every corner of the globe, from the highlands of Peru to the islands of Polynesia, from the forests of North America to the plains of Africa. Their ubiquity raises a profound question. Are these independent creations, each culture developing similar stories in response to local flooding events, or do they represent fragments of a shared human memory, echoes of some actual catastrophe so devastating that it became embedded in the collective consciousness of our species? The biblical flood narrative, familiar to billions through the story of Noah and his ark, bears striking similarities to the earlier Mesopotamian accounts. In the book of Genesis, God warns Noah that he will send a flood to destroy the wicked world. Noah builds an ark according to divine specifications, taking aboard his family and representatives of all animal species. The flood covers the earth for 40 days and 40 nights, destroying all life outside the ark. When the waters recede, Noah sends forth a raven and then a dove to search for dry land, eventually coming to rest on Mount Ararat. God establishes a covenant with Noah, promising never again to destroy the earth with flood, setting the rainbow in the sky as a sign of this promise. Scholars have long noted the parallels between the Noah story and the earlier Mesopotamian flood narratives, particularly the Epic of Atrahasis and the flood story embedded in the Epic of Gilgamesh. The similarities are so striking that it seems virtually certain the biblical authors were familiar with and drew upon these Mesopotamian traditions. Both involve divine warning, boat construction, the preservation of animals, the use of birds to scout for dry land, and the making of sacrifices after the flood. The main differences lie in theological interpretation. Where the Mesopotamian gods send the flood because humans have become too noisy and disturbing, the biblical God acts in response to human wickedness and moral corruption. But flood myths extend far beyond the ancient Near East. In Hindu tradition, the story of Manu and the great fish bears remarkable similarities to the Mesopotamian and biblical accounts. According to the Matsya Purana, the god Vishnu warns Manu of an impending flood that will destroy all life. Appearing in the form of a fish, Vishnu instructs Manu to build a large boat and take aboard the 7 great sages and seeds of all living things. When the flood comes, the fish tows the boat through the waters to safety, eventually bringing it to rest on a mountain in the Himalayas. From Manu descends all subsequent humanity. This story fits within the broader Hindu concept of cyclical time and periodic destructions. Hindu cosmology describes vast ages called Yugas, which progress from a golden age of perfection through silver, bronze, and iron ages of increasing degradation. At the end of each cycle comes pralaya, a cosmic dissolution that destroys the world before it is born anew. The flood associated with Manu is interpreted as one such pralaya, a necessary destruction that clears the way for a new cycle of creation. Greek mythology preserves its own flood narrative in the story of Deucalion and Pyrrha. When Zeus decides to destroy the corrupt Bronze Age of humanity with a great deluge, the Titan Prometheus warns his son Deucalion, who builds a chest or ark and survives the flood with his wife Pyrrha. After 9 days and nights, their vessel comes to rest on Mount Parnassus. They make offerings to Zeus, who grants them permission to repopulate the earth. Following the oracle's advice, they throw stones over their shoulders, which transform into people. This Greek flood myth, like its Near Eastern and Hindu counterparts, marks a transition between ages, a destruction that enables renewal. Indigenous cultures of the Americas preserve numerous flood traditions. The Hopi people of North America tell of multiple worlds that ended in catastrophe, including one destroyed by water. According to their tradition, the faithful were saved by hiding in hollow reeds while the unfaithful perished. The Aztecs and other Mesoamerican cultures incorporated flood narratives into their elaborate cosmology of successive world ages. The Andean peoples of South America have similar traditions, as do many indigenous groups throughout both continents. In Polynesian mythology, the demigod Maui is sometimes credited with fishing up islands from beneath the ocean, a story that some scholars interpret as a memory of lands lost to rising seas. Australian Aboriginal traditions include stories of great floods and the drowning of coastal lands, stories that may preserve memories of the post-glacial sea level rise that created the Torres Strait and flooded the continental shelves. Some Aboriginal oral traditions describe specific geographic features that are now underwater, suggesting these stories might preserve memories extending back thousands of years. The accuracy of some Aboriginal coastal inundation stories has been confirmed by geological research. For instance, stories from the Spencer Gulf region of South Australia describe land that is now submerged, and these descriptions match the geography that existed before sea level rise around 12,000 years ago. Similarly, traditions from Port Phillip Bay in Victoria describe a time when the bay was dry land, which accords with its geological history. These correspondences suggest that at least some flood myths may preserve genuine historical memories transmitted orally across hundreds of generations. Even in African traditions, flood narratives appear with notable frequency. The Yoruba of West Africa tell of a flood sent by the supreme god Olorin to punish humanity. According to this tradition, humanity had become corrupt and forgetful of the divine, provoking Olorin to cleanse the world with water. Only those who maintained their spiritual purity survived by finding refuge on mountaintops. The Mandinka people have similar stories, as do various East African cultures. The Malagasy people of Madagascar tell of a great flood that covered the earth, from which a small remnant of humanity survived in a boat. These African flood myths often emphasize the theme of divine punishment for human transgression, a moral dimension common to many flood narratives worldwide. The flood tradition appears in Zoroastrian texts from ancient Persia, where the righteous Yima is warned by the god Ahura Mazda about a coming winter that will bring destructive snow and ice. Yima builds an underground var, a kind of sanctuary, where he preserves representatives of all living things. While this differs from waterflood narratives, it shares the pattern of divine warning, preservation of life, and world-destroying catastrophe followed by renewal. Native American traditions across both continents preserve numerous flood stories, each with distinctive cultural elements. The Ojibwe tell of a great flood from which the culture hero Nanabozo survived by floating on a log with various animals. In their tradition, the animals dove down to retrieve mud from beneath the waters, which was then used to recreate the land. The Hopi describe multiple world ages, including one that ended in a great flood. According to their tradition, the faithful were saved by climbing inside hollow reeds while the unfaithful perished. The Cherokee tell of a flood sent to punish humanity, from which only a single family survived by building a boat. In South America, the Inca traditions speak of a great flood from which only 2 people survived on a mountaintop, subsequently repopulating the world. The Muisca people of Colombia tell of a flood caused by the goddess Basho weeping for the sins of humanity. Various Amazonian peoples have flood traditions that describe the rising of rivers and the transformation of the landscape. The diversity of these American flood myths, combined with their geographic distribution from the Arctic to Tierra del Fuego, suggests that flood narratives are indeed a nearly universal human phenomenon. What are we to make of this astonishing convergence of stories across human cultures? Several explanations have been proposed, each with its own implications for how we understand human history and the relationship between myth and reality. The most conservative explanation suggests that flood myths arose independently in many different locations because flooding is a nearly universal human experience. Any society living near rivers, lakes, or coastlines will eventually experience devastating floods. These local catastrophes, the argument goes, naturally become embedded in cultural narratives and over time take on mythic proportions, expanding from local events into world-destroying deluges. The similarity between different flood myths is thus not evidence of a shared historical event but rather a reflection of similar human responses to similar natural disasters. This explanation has merit, particularly when we consider the archaeological evidence for major flood events in various locations. As mentioned earlier, Mesopotamia experienced periodic catastrophic flooding due to its geography. Similarly, civilizations that developed along the Indus, Nile, Yellow, and other major rivers would have been intimately familiar with the destructive power of floods. The tendency of rivers to overflow their banks and destroy human settlements would naturally give rise to flood narratives. However, this explanation struggles to account for certain peculiar similarities between geographically separated flood myths. Why do so many of them involve specifically a boat or ark as the means of survival? Why do multiple versions include the detail of birds being sent out to search for dry land? Why do they so often frame the flood as both punishment and renewal, destruction and new beginning? A second explanation proposes diffusion of the flood story from a single source, most likely Mesopotamia, where we have the earliest written versions. According to this theory, the Mesopotamian flood narrative spread through trade, migration and cultural contact to other regions, where it was adapted and modified to fit local contexts and beliefs. The biblical flood story is clearly an example of such transmission, and it's possible that other versions also derive ultimately from Mesopotamian sources. Yet this diffusionist explanation also has limitations. How would the Mesopotamian flood story have reached remote Pacific islands or the Americas in ancient times? While we now know that ancient peoples were more mobile and had more extensive contact networks than once believed, it seems implausible that a Mesopotamian narrative could have spread to every corner of the globe, particularly when many flood myths come from regions that had no known contact with Near Eastern civilizations. A third, more controversial explanation suggests that many flood myths may preserve actual memories of a real, catastrophic flooding event or series of events that affected large portions of the globe. The most commonly cited candidate for such an event is the dramatic rise in sea levels that occurred at the end of the last ice age, approximately 11,700 years ago and extending over several millennia. During the last glacial maximum, around 20,000 years ago, sea levels were approximately 400 feet lower than they are today. Vast ice sheets covered much of the northern hemisphere, locking up enormous quantities of water. As the climate warmed and these ice sheets melted, sea levels rose dramatically, flooding coastal plains and drowning vast areas of land that had been inhabited by human populations. This process was not smooth or gradual. There is evidence for several periods of extremely rapid sea level rise, including an event called Meltwater Pulse 1A around 14,600 years ago, during which sea levels may have risen as much as 50 feet in just a few centuries. Another rapid rise occurred around 8,200 years ago. These events would have been catastrophic for coastal populations, potentially displacing millions of people and drowning countless settlements. Some researchers have argued that these post-glacial flooding events could be the kernel of truth at the heart of flood myths worldwide. The rising seas would have forced coastal populations to migrate inland, carrying with them the traumatic memory of lands lost beneath the waters. Over thousands of years of oral transmission, these memories could have been transformed into myths of world-destroying floods and divine punishment. Geologist Cesare Emiliani proposed in the 1970s that a catastrophic flooding of the Persian Gulf around 9,000 to 10,000 years ago could have been the source of Near Eastern flood traditions, including the Sumerian and biblical narratives. More recently, geologists William Ryan and Walter Pittman have suggested that the catastrophic flooding of the Black Sea Basin around 5,600 years before the Common Era, when rising Mediterranean waters breached the Bosphorus Strait, could have given rise to flood narratives in regions around the Black Sea. Even more controversial are theories proposing sudden, catastrophic flooding events triggered by comet or asteroid impacts. Some researchers, including Graham Hancock, have argued that a series of comet impacts around 12,800 years ago triggered rapid melting of ice sheets and catastrophic flooding, destroying an advanced Ice Age civilization and giving rise to flood myths worldwide. This Younger Dryas impact hypothesis remains hotly debated in the scientific community, with proponents citing evidence of impact markers at sites around the world and critics arguing that the evidence is inconclusive or has alternative explanations. Regardless of whether flood myths derive from a single catastrophic event, multiple regional floods, or the universal human experience of flooding, their importance lies not just in their possible historical basis but in what they reveal about how human cultures understand time and change. Flood myths almost universally serve as markers of transition, dividing one age from another. They represent not just physical destruction but ontological rupture, the ending of one world and the beginning of another. In this sense, whether the flood really happened in any literal sense may be less important than the psychological and philosophical truth it expresses. Human societies have repeatedly experienced catastrophic change, whether through natural disasters, climate shifts, warfare, or other causes. The flood myth provides a narrative framework for understanding such ruptures, a way of making sense of why the world is as it is and not otherwise. It explains loss, justifies suffering, and promises renewal. It suggests that destruction is not final, that after the deluge comes new growth, that the end of one cycle heralds the beginning of another. This cyclical understanding of time and history, so clearly expressed in flood myths worldwide, stands in stark contrast to the linear, progressive narrative that has dominated Western thought for the past few centuries. But it is to this cyclical worldview, and its most sophisticated expressions in various ancient philosophies, that we must now turn our attention. The flood myths we have explored reveal something fundamental about how many ancient cultures understood the passage of time. Rather than seeing history as a straight line moving from primitive beginnings toward an ever-improving future, they conceived of time as cyclical, characterized by recurring patterns of creation, flourishing, decline, and destruction followed by renewal. This cyclical worldview found its most elaborate expression in the philosophical and cosmological systems of several ancient civilizations, particularly in the Hindu concept of yugas and the Mayan understanding of cosmic cycles. Hindu cosmology presents perhaps the most detailed and mathematically sophisticated cyclical model of time in human thought. According to Hindu philosophy, the universe moves through vast cosmic cycles called kalpas, each lasting billions of years. Within each kalpa are smaller cycles called mahayugas, and within each mahayuga are 4 yugas or ages, each progressively shorter and more degraded than the last. The 4 yugas are Satya Yuga, also called Krita Yuga, the golden age of truth and perfection; Treta Yuga, the silver age when virtue begins to decline; Dvapara Yuga, the bronze age of increasing corruption; and Kali Yuga, the iron age of darkness and degradation. These 4 ages together constitute one complete Mahayuga cycle. The duration of these ages is precisely specified in Hindu texts such as the Surya Siddhanta and the Puranas. Satya Yuga lasts 1,728,000 years, Treta Yuga lasts 1,296,000 years, Dvapara Yuga lasts 864,000 years, and Kali Yuga lasts 432,000 years. Together, these 4 ages total 4,320,000 years, which equals one Mahayuga. 1,000 such Mahayugas constitute one kalpa, or one day of Brahma the Creator, lasting 4.32 billion years. Each kalpa is followed by a night of equal length, during which the universe is dissolved in pralaya. After this dissolution comes a new day of Brahma, a new kalpa, and the cycle begins again. These numbers are not arbitrary but follow a precise mathematical pattern based on the ratio 4 to 3 to 2 to 1. Satya Yuga is 4 parts, Treta Yuga is 3 parts, Dvapara Yuga is 2 parts, and Kali Yuga is 1 part. This declining ratio reflects the progressive degeneration of Dharma, the cosmic order and righteous duty that sustains the universe. In Satya Yuga, Dharma stands on 4 legs and is complete. By Kali Yuga, it stands on only 1 leg and is barely functional. According to Hindu tradition, we are currently living in Kali Yuga, which began with the death of Krishna in 3102 years before the Common Era. This age is characterized by strife, ignorance, materialism, and moral decay. Yet it is also seen as an age of spiritual opportunity, for in the Kali Yuga, even small spiritual efforts yield great results. At the end of Kali Yuga, the world will be destroyed by fire and flood, clearing the way for a new Satya Yuga to begin. This cyclical view of time has profound implications. Human history is not seen as progressing towards some ultimate goal or perfection. Instead, each cycle moves from an initial state of perfection through progressive stages of decline until destruction becomes necessary and the cycle begins anew. The goal is not to perfect the world, which is impossible within this framework, but to escape the cycle entirely through spiritual realization and liberation from the wheel of rebirth. The ancient Maya of Mesoamerica developed their own sophisticated understanding of cyclical time, expressed through multiple interlocking calendar systems. The Tzolk'in, a 260-day sacred calendar, meshed with the Hab, a 365-day solar calendar, to create a 52-year cycle called the calendar round. But beyond these relatively short cycles, the Maya conceived of much vaster periods of time. The Maya long count calendar measured time from a creation event that occurred in our calendar, on August 11, 3114 years before the Common Era. Time was counted in various units: kin 1 day, unal 20 days, tun 360 days, katun 7,200 days, and baktan 144,000 days. 13 baktuns constituted one great cycle of approximately 5,125 years. According to Maya belief, the current world exists within this great cycle, which would complete on December 21, 2012 in our calendar, an event that generated considerable apocalyptic speculation in the early 21st century. The Maya, like the Hindus, believed that the world had been created and destroyed multiple times. The Popol Vuh, the sacred book of the Kitch Maya, describes 3 previous creations that were destroyed because the gods were unsatisfied with the beings they had created. Only in the 4th creation were humans successfully made from maize, and it is in this 4th world that we live. This theme of multiple worlds or ages, each ending in catastrophe, echoes the pattern we see in Hindu yugas and in flood myths worldwide. The Maya fascination with astronomy and their precise mathematical understanding of celestial cycles suggests they saw time not as an arbitrary human construction but as intimately linked to cosmic rhythms. Their great cities were oriented to astronomical events, their monuments aligned with the movements of sun, moon, and planets. They could predict eclipses with remarkable accuracy and calculated the synodic period of Venus with precision that matches modern measurements. Some researchers have argued that the Maya were aware of the precession of the equinoxes, the slow 26,000-year wobble of Earth's axis that causes the position of the stars to gradually shift. If true, this would suggest the Maya understood that time operates on scales vastly exceeding human lifespans, that the cosmic cycles they sought to track and understand extended far beyond the rise and fall of any single civilization. The ancient Greeks also conceived of time in cyclical terms, though their system was less mathematically elaborate than the Hindu or Maya versions. Hesiod, writing in the 8th or 7th century before the Common Era, described 5 ages of humanity: the Golden Age, when humans lived like gods without toil or sorrow; the Silver Age, when humans were less noble but still innocent; the Bronze Age, characterized by warfare and violence; the Heroic Age, the time of the great heroes celebrated in Greek myths; and finally the Iron Age, Hesiod's own time, marked by toil, suffering and moral decay. This Greek conception shares with Hindu and Maya thought the idea of progressive decline from an initial golden age. Hesiod expresses nostalgia for the past and pessimism about the present and future. He wishes he had either been born earlier, in one of the better ages, or later, after the current Iron Age had run its course and, presumably, a new cycle had begun. The idea of eternal recurrence, the notion that all events repeat endlessly through infinite cycles of time, found expression in various Greek philosophical schools. The Pythagoreans believed in an eternal return of all things, and the Stoics developed the doctrine of ekpyrosis, a periodic destruction of the world by fire, after which the cosmos would be reborn in exactly the same form, down to the smallest detail, to play out the same history again and again for eternity. These cyclical conceptions of time were not limited to the ancient world. Indigenous Australian Aboriginals speak of the dream time, an eternal present in which ancestral beings created the world and continue to shape it. This is not a linear past but a dimension of reality that exists alongside the mundane present, accessible through ritual and sacred sites. The dream time thus represents a kind of cyclical or eternal time that contrasts sharply with Western linear chronology. In Chinese philosophy, the concept of the mandate of heaven describes a cyclical pattern in political history. Dynasties rise when they possess the mandate, ruling justly and effectively. But eventually they become corrupt and lose the mandate, leading to their downfall and replacement by a new dynasty that has gained heaven's favor. This cycle of rise, decline, and fall has repeated throughout Chinese history, and many Chinese thinkers saw it as reflecting cosmic principles rather than mere political fortune. African cosmologies often incorporate cyclical time, seeing the present as intimately connected to the ancestral past. The Dogon people of Mali possess sophisticated astronomical knowledge and organize their ritual calendar around the 60-year orbital period of Sirius B around Sirius A, a fact that has led to considerable speculation about how they acquired such knowledge. Even in ancient Mesopotamia, despite the linear chronology of the Sumerian king list, there are hints of cyclical thinking. The Babylonian New Year festival, Akitu, involved a ritual reenactment of creation, suggesting a yearly renewal of cosmic order. The concept of the Sabbath in Jewish tradition, culminating in the sabbatical year every 7 years and the Jubilee every 50 years, reflects cyclical patterns of time and social renewal. Common to all these cyclical conceptions is a sense that time is not simply empty duration but filled with meaning and pattern. The cycles are not random but follow intelligible rhythms linked to cosmic forces. Human events participate in these larger patterns, and understanding them provides insight into the nature of reality itself. Moreover, cyclical time tends to produce a different relationship to the past than linear time. In a linear framework, the past is dead, superseded, left behind as we march forward into the future. But in a cyclical framework, the past is never truly past. It returns, it recurs, it remains relevant because the patterns it established continue to unfold. The ancients are not primitive precursors to our superiority but participants in the same eternal cycles we inhabit. This cyclical worldview also generates different attitudes toward change and progress. From a linear perspective, change represents movement toward a goal, ideally improvement and advancement. From a cyclical perspective, change is simply movement through predictable phases. What rises must fall. What flourishes must wither. Winter follows autumn as certainly as decline follows zenith. There is a certain fatalism in this view, but also a profound acceptance of impermanence and a recognition that destruction is not failure but a necessary prelude to renewal. Perhaps most significantly, cyclical conceptions of time direct attention to cosmic scales and rhythms. The vast yugas of Hindu cosmology, extending over millions of years, and the Maya calculations spanning thousands of years suggest that ancient peoples were capable of thinking in temporal frameworks that dwarf the brief span of individual human life or even of entire civilizations. They embedded themselves within cosmic time, seeing human affairs as playing out against a backdrop of stellar movements, planetary cycles, and vast ages of the Earth itself. This brings us to one of the most remarkable aspects of ancient cosmological thought: the apparent knowledge of astronomical cycles so vast that they require centuries of careful observation to detect. Chief among these is the precession of the equinoxes, a phenomenon central to understanding how ancient peoples conceived of the great cosmic cycles that govern existence. The precession of the equinoxes represents one of the subtlest yet most significant celestial motions that ancient astronomers might have detected. Unlike the obvious daily rotation of the sky or the yearly journey of the sun through the zodiac, precession reveals itself only to observers who maintain careful records across multiple generations and possess the analytical skills to recognize the pattern in their data. This makes the apparent awareness of precession in various ancient cultures all the more remarkable and raises profound questions about the continuity of astronomical observation in the ancient world. To fully appreciate what precession means and why its discovery matters, we must understand the mechanics of Earth's motion. Our planet spins on its axis once per day, creating the apparent daily rotation of the celestial sphere. Earth also orbits the Sun once per year, creating the Sun's apparent annual journey through the zodiac. But Earth's axis itself is not fixed in space. Due to gravitational forces from the Sun and Moon acting on Earth's equatorial bulge, combined with the planet's rotation, the axis traces out a slow circle in space, much like a spinning top wobbles as it spins. This wobble is extraordinarily slow. It takes approximately 25,772 years for Earth's axis to complete one full circuit. During this time, the north celestial pole traces a circle roughly 47 degrees in diameter through the northern sky. This means that the star we use as our pole star changes over millennia. Today, Polaris sits very close to the north celestial pole, but this is a temporary circumstance. In 300 years before the Common Era, when the pyramids were being built in Egypt, the pole star was Thuban in the constellation Draco. In the future, around 14,000 years from now, the bright star Vega in the constellation Lyra will become the North Pole star. For ancient peoples who carefully tracked the positions of stars, this slow drift would eventually become noticeable. A star that culminated at a certain altitude above the horizon at a particular time of year would, over many generations, slowly shift its position. More significantly for agricultural societies that needed to track the seasons, the constellation in which the sun rose at the spring equinox would gradually change. The equinox points themselves, where the celestial equator crosses the ecliptic, slowly drift westward through the zodiac. This westward drift means that the sun appears to move backward through the zodiacal constellations over vast periods of time. While the sun moves through the zodiac from west to east during its yearly journey, the equinox points slowly move from east to west through the zodiac. Thus, if you observe the constellation rising heliacally with the sun at the spring equinox over many centuries, you will see that constellation gradually change, moving backward through the zodiac at a rate of about 1 degree every 72 years. This specific number, 72 years per degree, appears with remarkable frequency in ancient texts and architectural measurements, leading some researchers to speculate that it served as a kind of code indicating knowledge of precession. In the Hindu system of yugas, we find 432,000 years for the Kali Yuga, which is 600 times 720, or 6,000 times 72. The Norse myth of Valhalla describes 432,000 warriors, again incorporating this significant number. In the biblical tradition, some calculations based on Genesis chronology produce numbers that are multiples of 72. Whether these correspondences indicate actual knowledge of precession or are merely coincidental remains a matter of intense debate. Imagine standing at a specific location on Earth, watching the sun rise on the morning of the spring equinox, that moment when day and night are equal in length. Behind the sun, arrayed across the eastern horizon, the stars of the zodiac stretch in an ancient celestial belt. Now imagine returning to that same spot on the same date 72 years later. You would notice something subtle but profound. The background constellation against which the sun rises has shifted slightly. The sun has moved backward through the zodiac, precessing through the constellations in a direction opposite to its yearly motion. This phenomenon, known as the precession of the equinoxes, is caused by a slow wobble in Earth's axis of rotation. Like a spinning top that wobbles as it spins, Earth's axis traces out a circle in space, completing one full circuit approximately every 25,772 years. This means that the position of the celestial pole, the point in the sky around which all the stars appear to rotate, changes over time. Currently, the north celestial pole points very close to the star Polaris, but 5,000 years ago it pointed toward Thuban in the constellation Draco, and in another 12,000 years it will point near the star Vega. More significantly for ancient peoples who tracked the movements of the sun, moon and planets, the precession of the equinoxes means that the constellation in which the sun rises on the spring equinox gradually changes over time. The sun spends approximately 2,160 years in each constellation of the zodiac, taking about 25,920 years to complete the full circuit. This vast cycle came to be known as the Great Year or the Platonic Year. The discovery of precession is generally attributed to the Greek astronomer Hipparchus of Nicaea, who lived in the 2nd century before the Common Era. By comparing observations of stellar positions made in his own time with measurements recorded by earlier astronomers, including the Babylonians Timacaris and Aristillus, Hipparchus noticed that the stars had shifted their positions relative to the equinoxes. Specifically, he found that the star Spica had moved about 2 degrees over the preceding 150 years. From this, he calculated that the equinoxes were precessing through the zodiac at a rate of at least 1 degree per century, meaning the complete cycle would take no more than 36,000 years. This was a remarkable achievement of observational astronomy. Detecting precession requires comparing precise measurements separated by at least a century or more. The shift is too subtle to be noticed within a single human lifetime, which means its discovery depends on access to accurate records maintained over multiple generations. That the Babylonians and Greeks possessed such records and the analytical capability to extract this pattern from them demonstrates the sophisticated nature of ancient astronomy. But here we encounter a fascinating mystery. Did other ancient cultures, beyond the Greeks and Babylonians, also know about precession? And if so, what might that tell us about the antiquity and sophistication of astronomical knowledge? Several researchers have argued that knowledge of precession was far more widespread in the ancient world than conventional scholarship acknowledges. The evidence for this claim is circumstantial but intriguing, based primarily on the astronomical orientations of ancient monuments and the recurrence of specific numbers in ancient texts and architectural measurements. Consider the Great Pyramid of Giza. This monument, built around 2,560 years before the Common Era during the reign of Pharaoh Khufu, is oriented to the cardinal directions with astonishing precision. The 4 sides of the pyramid align with north, south, east, and west to within a tiny fraction of a degree. How did the ancient Egyptians achieve such accuracy? One method would involve tracking the positions of stars as they rise and set, then calculating the midpoint between these positions to determine true north. But Earth's precession means that the stellar positions used for such calculations would need to be adjusted over time. The angle of the pyramid's slope, measured at 51 degrees 51 minutes and 14 seconds, has been noted by some researchers to encode the ratio of the pyramid's height to its base perimeter, which approximates pi. But others have suggested that this angle might encode information about Earth's axial precession. If we take the angle and double it, we get approximately 103.7 degrees. If we have this to get 51.85 degrees and multiply by 500, we get 25,925, remarkably close to the 25,920-year precessional cycle. Could the pyramid builders have deliberately encoded this cosmic cycle in stone? Researchers Robert Bauval and Graham Hancock have proposed that the Giza pyramid complex as a whole encodes astronomical knowledge related to precession. According to their Orion correlation theory, the 3 main pyramids at Giza are positioned to mirror the 3 stars of Orion's belt, while the nearby Sphinx represents the constellation Leo. Using computer simulations of the ancient sky, they argue that the monuments align with how these constellations appeared around 10,500 years before the Common Era, during the astrological age of Leo. They suggest this date might represent Zep Tepi, the first time mentioned in Egyptian texts, a mythical golden age when the gods walked the earth and established the foundations of Egyptian civilization. These claims remain highly controversial among Egyptologists and astronomers, who point out various problems with the alignment calculations and question whether the ancient Egyptians had zodiacal constellations in the forms we know them. Critics note that the vernal equinox around 10,500 years before the Common Era was actually in Virgo, not Leo, and that the Mesopotamian zodiac was not adopted in Egypt until much later. The alignment between the pyramids and Orion's belt, while suggestive, is not perfect and may be coincidental. Nevertheless, the fact remains that ancient Egyptian temples and monuments show clear evidence of astronomical alignment and that the Egyptians possessed sophisticated astronomical knowledge. The ceiling of the tomb of Senmut, an official of Queen Hatshepsut who ruled around 1470 years before the Common Era, displays a remarkably accurate star chart. The Dendera zodiac, a bas-relief from the ceiling of the Temple of Hathor at Dendera dating to the 1st century before the Common Era, shows zodiacal constellations in forms that demonstrate clear astronomical knowledge, though scholars debate how much of this reflects indigenous Egyptian tradition versus Greek influence. Beyond Egypt, other ancient sites display astronomical alignments that suggest awareness of celestial cycles. Stonehenge in England, built in stages between about 3,000 and 1,500 years before the Common Era, famously aligns with the summer solstice sunrise and winter solstice sunset. More remarkably, recent research suggests that Stonehenge may also encode knowledge of the 18.6-year cycle of the moon's major standstill, when the moon reaches its most extreme positions in the sky. In the Americas, the Maya demonstrated extraordinary astronomical knowledge. They calculated the synodic period of Venus with remarkable precision, and their eclipse prediction methods rivaled or exceeded those of contemporary Old World civilizations. The Maya-created long count calendar requires sustained astronomical observation and sophisticated mathematics. Whether they knew about precession remains debated, but some researchers point to apparent precessional symbolism in Maya art and architecture. The Hopi people of North America describe their cosmology in terms of world ages that some researchers have linked to precessional cycles. The Dogon people of Mali possess astronomical knowledge that has puzzled researchers, particularly their apparent awareness of the binary nature of Sirius and its 50-year orbital period, though the source of this knowledge remains disputed. In Hindu astronomy, the concept of Ayanamsa refers to the precession of the equinoxes. Ancient Indian astronomical texts like the Surya Siddhanta demonstrate awareness of precession, though they initially conceived of it as a back-and-forth oscillation or trepidation rather than a continuous cycle. The great Hindu yugas, particularly the ascending and descending phases, have been interpreted by some researchers as related to precessional cycles, though mainstream Indologists generally view the yugas as primarily mythological rather than astronomical constructs. The key question all this raises is, how old is knowledge of precession? If Hipparchus discovered it in the 2nd century before the Common Era, as the conventional narrative holds, then references to precession or precessionally based cycles in earlier cultures must be either coincidental, based on different phenomena that happen to have similar periods, or evidence of even earlier astronomical discoveries that were not preserved in writing. Some researchers, particularly those associated with the alternative archaeology movement, have argued that knowledge of precession could date back to the end of the last ice age or even earlier, preserved through oral traditions and encoded in monuments and myths. They point to the global distribution of flood myths, which often describe astronomical phenomena and may encode observations of the sky at specific precessional epochs. They note that many ancient myths, when analyzed through the lens of astronomical allegory, seem to describe changes in the celestial landscape that could only be explained by precession. The late historians Giorgio de Santillana and Hertha von Duchenne, in their controversial book, Hamlet's Mill, argued that ancient myths from around the world encode sophisticated astronomical knowledge, particularly awareness of precession. They analyzed myths featuring grinding mills, cosmic trees, and rotating heavens, interpreting these as metaphors for the slow turning of the celestial sphere through the precessional cycle. While their specific interpretations have been criticized by many scholars, their work raised important questions about the astronomical knowledge embedded in mythology. The significance of precession for ancient peoples would have been profound. To cultures that saw the heavens as a sacred realm and sought meaning in celestial patterns, the discovery that even the fixed stars were not truly fixed, that the cosmic order itself was slowly revolving through a vast cycle, would have had enormous philosophical and religious implications. It suggested that time operated on scales far exceeding human comprehension, that the universe followed rhythms measured not in years or lifetimes but in ages and epochs. The concept of astrological ages, each lasting approximately 2,160 years and named for the constellation in which the sun rises at the spring equinox, derives directly from the precession of the equinoxes. Currently, we are said to be transitioning from the age of Pisces to the age of Aquarius, a shift that has inspired considerable New Age speculation. Before Pisces came the age of Aries and before that the age of Taurus. Some researchers have argued that awareness of these ages is preserved in ancient symbolism. The transition from the age of Taurus to the age of Aries around 2000 years before the Common Era coincides with the shift in ancient Near Eastern religion from bull worship to ram worship. The golden calf that the Israelites worship in Exodus, only to have it destroyed by Moses, has been interpreted as representing the old age of Taurus giving way to the new age of Aries, symbolized by the ram's horns. Moses is often depicted as having. The age of Pisces, which began around the start of the Common Era, is associated with the fish symbol of early Christianity. Whether these correspondences reflect actual awareness of precession and deliberate use of astrological age symbolism, or whether they are coincidental and have been retrospectively imposed on ancient symbols, remains hotly debated. What seems clear is that many ancient cultures paid close attention to the sky and developed surprisingly sophisticated astronomical knowledge. The precession of the equinoxes represents one of the longest cycles accessible to human observation and calculation. It links human timekeeping to the vast cosmic rhythms of the rotating Earth and the slowly shifting celestial sphere. For cultures that thought in terms of cyclical time, in Yugas and world ages, the great year of precession would have provided a natural timepiece, a cosmic clock marking out the longest cycle they could perceive. This brings us back to the question of lost knowledge and lost civilizations. If ancient peoples possessed knowledge of astronomical cycles requiring centuries of observation to detect, what does this tell us about the continuity of their civilizations and the transmission of knowledge across generations? And if knowledge of precession was indeed more widespread in the ancient world than we typically acknowledge, might this support claims that human civilization is far older and more sophisticated than conventional chronology allows? The idea that advanced civilizations existed in the distant past, only to be destroyed by catastrophe and forgotten by history, has captivated human imagination for millennia. No legendary lost civilization has sparked more fascination, speculation, and controversy than Atlantis, first described by the Greek philosopher Plato in his dialogues Timaeus and Critias, written around 360 years before the Common Era. According to Plato's account, Atlantis was a powerful island civilization that existed more than 9,000 years before his own time, located beyond the Pillars of Hercules, which we now know as the Strait of Gibraltar. Plato describes Atlantis as larger than Libya and Asia combined, possessing vast natural resources, advanced engineering, and a powerful military. The Atlanteans built a magnificent capital city with concentric rings of water and land, connected by tunnels and bridges. At the center stood a great temple to Poseidon, decorated with gold, silver, and orichalcum, a mysterious metal that may have been a copper alloy. Initially, the Atlanteans were noble and virtuous, but over time they became corrupted by pride and greed. Their moral decay eventually offended the gods, and Zeus decided to punish them. In a single day and night of catastrophic earthquakes and floods, Atlantis sank beneath the sea, disappearing forever. Plato explicitly states that this destruction occurred 9,000 years before the time of Solon, which would place the event around 9,600 years before the Common Era. Modern scholars generally agree that Plato's Atlantis was a philosophical allegory rather than a historical account. In the Timaeus and Critias, Atlantis serves as a foil for Plato's ideal state, described in his earlier work The Republic. The Atlanteans represent what happens when a society blessed with abundance and power abandons virtue and justice. Their destruction demonstrates divine punishment for hubris and moral corruption. Yet Plato's vivid details and his insistence that the story came to him through a chain of transmission beginning with Egyptian priests speaking to Solon have convinced many throughout history that Atlantis might have been real. This belief intensified in the late 19th century with the publication of Ignatius Donnelly's Atlantis, The Antediluvian World in 1882. Donnelly, a former United States congressman and amateur scholar, argued that Atlantis was a real advanced civilization that had existed in the Atlantic Ocean exactly where Plato said it did. According to Donnelly, the Atlanteans possessed sophisticated technology and were the source of all major human innovations, including agriculture, metallurgy, writing, and architecture. When catastrophe destroyed Atlantis, survivors fled to various parts of the world, establishing colonies in Egypt, Mesopotamia, and the Americas. This explained, in Donnelly's view, the remarkable similarities between ancient civilizations separated by vast oceans. The pyramids of Egypt and Mesoamerica, the flood myths found worldwide, the astronomical knowledge shared by distant cultures. Donnelly's book was enormously influential, sparking a wave of Atlantis speculation that continues to this day. He convinced many readers that the legend of Atlantis contained a kernel of historical truth and that archaeology would eventually prove the existence of this lost civilization. The fact that modern oceanography and plate tectonics have since demonstrated that no continent could have existed in the mid-Atlantic where Donnelly placed Atlantis has done little to dampen enthusiasm for the idea. If Atlantis did not exist in the Atlantic Ocean, might it have been located elsewhere? Various candidates have been proposed over the years. The most scientifically credible suggestion identifies Atlantis with the Minoan civilization of ancient Crete, which was devastated by the massive volcanic eruption of Thera, modern Santorini, around 1,600 years before the Common Era. This eruption was one of the largest in recorded history, destroying cities, generating tsunamis, and possibly contributing to the decline of Minoan civilization. The Thera theory has several points in its favor. The destruction was indeed sudden and catastrophic, taking place in a single day and night as Plato described, though of course the island did not sink but rather exploded. The Minoan civilization was advanced and wealthy, engaged in extensive maritime trade. The eruption date of around 1,600 years before the Common Era, when shifted forward the proper amount due to Egyptian chronological conventions, roughly corresponds to Plato's time frame if we assume he was working from Egyptian sources that had their own ways of counting years. However, the theory has significant problems. Thera is located inside the Mediterranean, not beyond the Pillars of Hercules. The Minoan civilization, while impressive, was not larger than Libya and Asia combined, nor did it menace Athens as Atlantis supposedly did. Most damagingly, Plato explicitly states that Atlantis existed 9,000 years before Solon's time, which would be around 9,600 years before the Common Era, far earlier than the Thera eruption. Other proposed locations for Atlantis have included the Black Sea, Antarctica, various Mediterranean islands, the Caribbean, and even the North Sea. Each theory must account for Plato's specific details while explaining why those details that don't fit should be considered corrupted, metaphorical, or simply wrong. A different approach suggests we should take Plato's 9,000-year time frame more seriously. If we do, Atlantis would have existed around 9,600 years before the Common Era, at the end of the last ice age. This was indeed a time of catastrophic climate change and rapid sea level rise as the great ice sheets melted. Coastal regions that had been inhabited during the Ice Age were inundated, and human populations were displaced. Could Atlantis be a dim cultural memory of an Ice Age coastal civilization destroyed by post-glacial flooding? This interpretation has been championed by Graham Hancock and other alternative historians. They argue that an advanced civilization existed during the Ice Age, possessing knowledge of astronomy, mathematics, and engineering that was lost when catastrophe struck. Survivors of this civilization, they suggest, traveled to various parts of the world, bringing their knowledge to hunter-gatherer societies and jump-starting the agricultural revolution and the birth of recorded history's first civilizations. In support of this theory, they point to several anomalies in the archaeological record. Sites like Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, a massive temple complex dating to around 9,600 years before the Common Era, constructed by people who were supposedly simple hunter-gatherers. The apparent astronomical sophistication of ancient monuments like the Great Pyramid. The myths of culture heroes and civilizing gods who appear in many ancient traditions, teaching agriculture and astronomy to primitive peoples. And the global distribution of flood myths that may preserve memories of the catastrophic flooding that ended the Ice Age. Mainstream archaeologists and historians remain deeply skeptical of these claims. They point out that there is no unambiguous archaeological evidence for an advanced Ice Age civilization. The sites and monuments cited by alternative historians can be explained without invoking a lost precursor civilization. Göbekli Tepe, while remarkable, shows a progression from simpler to more complex construction, exactly what we would expect from an indigenous development. The astronomical alignments of ancient monuments can be achieved without advanced mathematics, using simple observational techniques available to any culture that pays attention to the sky. Moreover, critics argue if an advanced Ice Age civilization existed and possessed the knowledge attributed to it, why did it leave no clear traces in the archaeological record? Why no writing systems, no metallurgy, no clear architectural traditions until much later? The alternative historians answer that most traces of this civilization were destroyed by the flood that ended the Ice Age, and that what survived was encoded in myths and monuments, strikes conventional scholars as special pleading, an unfalsifiable claim designed to explain away the absence of evidence. Yet the Atlantis story, whether historical or purely allegorical, touches on themes that resonate across human cultures. The idea of a golden age lost to catastrophe, knowledge that has been forgotten, wisdom that must be recovered. These themes appear not only in Plato's Atlantis but in numerous other legends of lost lands and vanished civilizations. The continent of Mu or Lemuria, proposed by various 19th and 20th century writers, was supposedly located in the Pacific Ocean and served as the motherland of human civilization. James Churchward claimed to have translated ancient tablets describing Mu as an advanced civilization that sank beneath the waves thousands of years ago. While Mu has no more archaeological support than Atlantis, the legend persists in alternative historical circles and New Age spirituality. Agartha or Agardi is said to be a subterranean civilization located within the hollow earth. This legend, popularized in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, holds that advanced beings dwell in vast caverns beneath the surface, possessing wisdom and technology far exceeding our own. While no credible evidence supports the existence of Agartha, the legend reflects deep-seated human fascination with hidden knowledge and lost worlds. Various cultures have their own traditions of lost lands. Tamil tradition speaks of Kumari Kandam, a continent in the Indian Ocean that sank beneath the waves, forcing its people to migrate to southern India. Celtic legends tell of Lyonesse, a land that once connected Cornwall to the Isles of Scilly before being inundated by the sea. Welsh tradition preserves stories of Cantorar Gwaelod, a kingdom in Cardigan Bay that was drowned when the keeper of the seawall neglected his duty. What unites all these legends is the theme of catastrophic loss, of a better time that has passed, of knowledge that has been forgotten. Whether these stories preserve actual historical memories of drowned coastlines and displaced populations, or whether they are simply variations on universal human anxieties about decline and mortality, they reveal something important about how we understand our place in time. The lost civilization narrative suggests that we are not at the pinnacle of human achievement but rather in the shadow of greater predecessors. It implies that history is not progressive but cyclical, that civilizations rise and fall, and that what we have achieved may have been achieved before and lost. This is, in essence, a cyclical view of history expressed through the language of myth and legend rather than philosophical cosmology. The enduring appeal of Atlantis and other lost civilizations may lie precisely in their challenge to the progressive narrative of history. They suggest humility in the face of time's vastness, caution about the permanence of our own civilization's achievements, and openness to the possibility that the past holds more mysteries than we acknowledge. Whether Atlantis was real or purely symbolic, it serves as a reminder that civilizations can fall, knowledge can be lost, and the confident certainties of one age can become the forgotten myths of another. This brings us to examine not legendary but historically attested civilizations that did indeed rise to great heights only to collapse catastrophically, leaving behind ruins and questions for later ages to ponder. While legends of Atlantis capture the imagination with their tales of sudden catastrophic destruction, the actual historical record provides numerous examples of civilizations that rose to prominence, flourished for centuries and then collapsed, sometimes dramatically, sometimes through slow decline. These real collapses, documented by archaeology and written records, reveal patterns that repeat across time and geography, lending support to the cyclical view of history while also providing insight into the vulnerabilities that all complex societies share. The fall of civilizations is not a simple process with a single cause. Rather, it typically involves the interaction of multiple stressors, environmental, economic, political, and social, that overwhelm a society's capacity to adapt. Some collapses are relatively rapid, taking place over a few decades or even years. Others unfold over centuries, with periods of partial recovery followed by renewed decline. Understanding why civilizations fall has practical urgency, for the patterns visible in past collapses may offer warnings relevant to our own time. One of the earliest documented civilization collapses affected the Indus Valley Civilization, which flourished in what is now Pakistan and northwestern India between approximately 3,300 and 1,300 years before the Common Era. At its peak around 2,500 years before the Common Era, this civilization boasted sophisticated urban centers including Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro, featuring advanced urban planning with grid-pattern streets, elaborate drainage systems, and standardized brick sizes that suggest centralized coordination. Yet around 1900 years before the Common Era, the Indus Valley Civilization entered a period of decline. Cities were gradually abandoned, writing disappeared, and the population dispersed. Archaeological evidence suggests increased violence and the spread of diseases like leprosy and tuberculosis. The causes of this collapse remain debated since the Indus script has not been deciphered, but most researchers point to environmental factors as primary drivers. Climate records indicate that the region experienced a significant drying trend beginning around 2,200 years before the Common Era, part of a broader climate event known as the 4.2 kiloyear event that affected civilizations across the Near East and Mediterranean. The monsoon rains that sustained Indus agriculture may have weakened or become more erratic. Additionally, there is evidence that the Gagar-Hakra river system, which supported many Indus settlements, began to dry up as the glaciers feeding it retreated. The combination of drought, river desiccation, and possible flooding from other rivers created environmental stresses that the civilization could not overcome. The collapse of the Indus Valley civilization coincided with similar events elsewhere. The Akkadian Empire in Mesopotamia fell around 2,200 years before the Common Era, with records describing severe drought and famine. Recent research has uncovered evidence of a major drought lasting perhaps 300 years that affected the entire region from the Mediterranean to India. This was not a localized event but a broad climate shift that destabilized civilizations across a vast area. The collapse of Bronze Age civilizations around 1,200 years before the Common Era represents one of the most dramatic and mysterious episodes in ancient history. Within a span of about 50 years, most of the great civilizations of the Eastern Mediterranean collapsed or were severely disrupted. The Hittite Empire in Anatolia disappeared. Mycenaean palace centers in Greece were destroyed and abandoned. Cities throughout the Levant burned. Egypt survived but was severely weakened and lost its empire. This period is sometimes called the Bronze Age collapse or the Late Bronze Age collapse. What caused this widespread catastrophe? No single explanation has achieved consensus among historians. Possible contributing factors include climate change and drought, invasions by the mysterious sea peoples mentioned in Egyptian records, internal rebellions and social upheaval, interruption of trade networks that Bronze Age economies depended upon, and possibly earthquakes and natural disasters. Recent research suggests that a perfect storm of climate stress, political instability, and systems failure may have created a cascade effect where problems in one region spread throughout the interconnected Bronze Age world. The collapse had profound consequences. The centuries following it, sometimes called the Greek Dark Ages, saw a dramatic reduction in population, literacy, and cultural complexity. Yet this collapse also cleared the way for new civilizations to emerge, including classical Greece and the Iron Age kingdoms of the Levant. Classical Maya civilization experienced a dramatic collapse between the 8th and 10th centuries of the Common Era. The Maya heartland in the Yucatan Peninsula and Guatemala had supported a sophisticated civilization featuring monumental architecture, complex writing, advanced astronomy and mathematics, and intensive agriculture. Yet between roughly 800 and 900 of the Common Era, the major Maya cities were abandoned, construction ceased, and the population declined catastrophically. Various factors have been implicated in the Maya collapse. Deforestation and soil erosion from intensive agriculture may have degraded the environmental base supporting the civilization. Climate studies have revealed evidence of severe droughts during this period. Political instability and warfare increased as city-states competed for dwindling resources. The elaborate ritual and political systems that sustained Maya civilization may have become maladaptive in the face of environmental stress, with elites continuing to demand resources for monument construction even as the agricultural base faltered. The Maya collapse was not total or uniform. Some cities survived or even flourished after the classic period. But the heartland cities were abandoned, and the civilization entered a post-classic phase that was markedly different from its earlier florescence. The ruins of Tikal, Palenque, and other great centers, swallowed by jungle, became mysterious monuments to a vanished greatness. The fall of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century of the Common Era has been analyzed extensively by historians seeking to understand how one of history's most powerful and long-lived civilizations could fragment and collapse. Rome's decline was a gradual process involving economic difficulties, political instability, military pressures, and cultural transformations. By the 3rd century, the empire faced mounting challenges. Maintaining the enormous military needed to defend Rome's vast borders became economically unsustainable. Political instability led to a rapid succession of emperors, many coming to power through military coup. Plague epidemics, particularly the Antonine Plague and the Plague of Cyprian, devastated the population. Inflation undermined the currency. Pressure from Germanic tribes along the northern frontier intensified. The empire's response to these challenges included dividing itself into eastern and western halves and adopting an increasingly centralized, militarized government. Christianity became the state religion, fundamentally transforming Roman culture. These adaptations prolonged Rome's existence but could not prevent eventual fragmentation of the Western Empire. In the 5th century, Germanic tribes began crossing the Rhine frontier in large numbers, not always as hostile invaders but often as refugees seeking safety from the Huns pressing from the east. The Western Roman Empire lacked the military and financial resources to absorb or repel these migrations. In 410, Visigoths sacked Rome itself, a shocking psychological blow. Further incursions followed, and in 476, the last Western Roman emperor was deposed. The fall of Rome has been attributed to factors ranging from lead poisoning to Christianity to moral decay. Modern historians emphasize structural economic and military problems, climate stress, and the cumulative effect of multiple challenges overwhelming the empire's adaptive capacity. Importantly, the Eastern Roman or Byzantine Empire survived for another 1,000 years, demonstrating that Rome's fall was not inevitable but resulted from specific circumstances affecting the Western Empire. The Khmer Empire, centered at Angkor in modern Cambodia, collapsed in the 15th century. At its height in the 12th century, Angkor was one of the world's largest cities, featuring massive temple complexes including Angkor Wat and Angkor Thom. The empire controlled a vast area of mainland Southeast Asia, extracting tribute from numerous vassal states and engaging in extensive trade networks that connected it to China, India, and the Islamic world. Recent research using LiDAR technology has revealed that Angkor was supported by an elaborate hydraulic infrastructure of canals, reservoirs, and water management systems. This system allowed intensive rice agriculture to support a large population, perhaps as many as 750,000 people in the urban area at its peak. The hydraulic network was a technological marvel, demonstrating sophisticated engineering and careful planning. But climate studies indicate that the 14th and 15th centuries brought severe fluctuations between drought and intense monsoons. The hydraulic system, optimized for stable conditions, could not cope with these extremes. During drought years, the reservoirs could not maintain sufficient water for irrigation. During monsoon years, the drainage channels were overwhelmed, causing flooding and damage to infrastructure. The intricate system of dikes, channels, and reservoirs began to fail. Damage to the water infrastructure compromised agricultural productivity, undermining the economic foundation of the empire. The costs of maintaining and repairing the system may have exceeded the benefits it provided, creating a negative feedback loop where declining resources meant less capacity to maintain infrastructure, which led to further resource decline. Combined with pressure from the expanding Thai kingdom of Ayutthaya to the west, these environmental and engineering stresses led to Angkor's abandonment in the 15th century. The population dispersed, many likely moving to areas less dependent on elaborate water management. The great temples were gradually reclaimed by jungle, becoming mysterious ruins that would fascinate later explorers. The Khmer civilization continued, but its center of gravity shifted southward to Phnom Penh, and it never recovered the glory of the Angkor period. The collapse of the Khmer Empire demonstrates how civilizations can become trapped by their own infrastructure. The massive investment in the hydraulic system made sense when it worked efficiently, generating agricultural surplus that supported a large population and funded monumental architecture. But this same investment created path dependency. The civilization became committed to a particular technological solution that proved vulnerable to environmental variability. When conditions changed, the civilization lacked the flexibility to adapt, having invested too heavily in infrastructure that worked well only under specific conditions. This pattern appears in other collapses as well. The ancestral Puebloan people of the American Southwest, particularly at sites like Chaco Canyon in New Mexico, built an impressive civilization in an arid environment. Between approximately 900 and 1150 of the Common Era, Chaco Canyon was the center of a complex society that constructed massive great houses, developed extensive road networks connecting outlying communities, and engaged in long-distance trade for materials like turquoise, shells, and macaw feathers from Mesoamerica. But the Chaco system was highly vulnerable to drought. The agriculture that supported this population depended on capturing and redistributing scarce water resources through careful land management. When a severe drought struck in the mid-12th century, the agricultural system could not sustain the population. The great houses were abandoned and the population dispersed. Some moved to the Rio Grande Valley, others to other regions where water was more reliable. The Chaco phenomenon collapsed not because its people lacked ingenuity or effort, but because their environment could not sustain the population density and social complexity they had achieved. The Norse colony in Greenland offers another instructive example of societal collapse resulting from environmental limits and cultural rigidity. Norse settlers established colonies in Greenland beginning around 985 of the Common Era, during a relatively warm period known as the Medieval Warm Period. For several centuries they maintained a society based on farming cattle and sheep, trade with Norway for essential goods like iron and timber, and some hunting of walrus for ivory to export to Europe. But Greenland's climate was always marginal for the type of farming the Norse practiced. As the climate cooled during the onset of the Little Ice Age beginning in the 14th century, farming became increasingly difficult. The growing season shortened, winter fodder for livestock became scarce, and the pastures deteriorated. The colony also depended critically on trade with Norway for resources they could not produce locally, and as Europe's interest in Greenland declined and walrus ivory became less valuable due to competition from elephant ivory reaching Europe via new trade routes, this lifeline weakened. Archaeological evidence suggests the Greenlanders made poor adaptive choices. They continued to focus on cattle farming and European agricultural practices rather than adopting Inuit subsistence strategies better suited to the Arctic environment. They apparently avoided eating fish, despite abundant marine resources, possibly due to cultural prohibitions or elite preferences. They deforested their limited woodlands for fuel and construction. They maintained a hierarchical social structure with a bishop and elite class that consumed resources even as the overall economy contracted. The Inuit people, by contrast, thrived in Greenland throughout this period because their subsistence strategies were adapted to Arctic conditions. They hunted seals, whales, and other marine mammals. They lived in more flexible social groups. They used kayaks and umiaks rather than the heavier European ships. But the Norse apparently viewed the Inuit as inferior and refused to learn from them, a cultural rigidity that proved fatal. By the mid-15th century, the Norse Greenland colony had been abandoned. Its final inhabitants either perished or, more likely, the remnant population finally gave up and returned to Iceland and Norway. The last recorded contact was in 1408 when a ship arrived for a wedding. After that, silence. When European explorers returned to Greenland in the 16th century, they found only ruins and Inuit inhabitants who had no memory of the Norse. These examples, drawn from different times and places and operating at different scales, reveal common patterns in civilizational collapse. Environmental stress, particularly climate change and resource depletion, appears repeatedly as a contributing factor. Societies adapted to specific environmental conditions often struggle when those conditions shift. Infrastructure and subsistence strategies that work well under certain circumstances can become liabilities when circumstances change. Cultural conservatism and elite resistance to adaptation play important roles in many collapses. The Norse in Greenland maintained their European farming practices even when those practices were failing. The classic Maya elite continued to demand resources for monument construction even as environmental degradation was undermining the agricultural base. Roman emperors in the late Empire attempted to maintain traditional structures even when radical reforms were needed. In each case, commitment to established ways of doing things prevented the flexible adaptation that might have allowed survival. Economic factors weave through most collapses. Trade disruption, currency devaluation, unsustainable costs of maintaining complexity, and the extraction of resources by elites beyond what the productive base can support all contribute to decline. Joseph Tainter's theory that complexity itself becomes a liability when it reaches the point of diminishing returns helps explain why civilizations often fail to solve problems through increased complexity. At some point, additional layers of bureaucracy, more elaborate infrastructure, more specialized roles, all of which once provided benefits, begin to cost more than they contribute. When this threshold is crossed, collapse to simpler forms of organization may actually improve average welfare, making it difficult to prevent even when collapse is recognized as a possibility. These examples, drawn from different times and places, reveal common patterns in civilizational collapse. Environmental stress, particularly climate change and drought, appears repeatedly as a contributing factor. Societies adapted to stable conditions often struggle when climate shifts. Resource depletion and environmental degradation, frequently the unintended consequence of intensive exploitation, can undermine the base supporting a civilization. Political and social instability often intensifies during times of stress. Competition for resources increases, leading to warfare and internal conflict. Complex political systems may become maladaptive, unable to respond flexibly to changing conditions. Elite groups sometimes maintain their privileges even as the broader society suffers, creating tensions that weaken social cohesion. Economic factors including trade disruption, currency devaluation, and the unsustainable cost of maintaining complexity play important roles. Many civilizations collapse when the economic surplus needed to support specialized functions, armies, bureaucracies, monument construction, can no longer be generated or extracted from an increasingly stressed population. Significantly, most collapses involve the interaction of multiple stresses rather than a single cause. A civilization might weather drought, invasion, or political upheaval individually, but when several challenges hit simultaneously or in rapid succession, adaptive capacity can be overwhelmed. This creates tipping points where what seemed like a robust civilization rapidly disintegrates. Archaeologist Joseph Tainter has argued that complexity itself becomes a vulnerability. As civilizations become more complex, with more specialized roles, elaborate bureaucracies, and extensive infrastructure, they require greater energy input and organizational overhead to maintain themselves. Eventually, Tainter suggests, civilizations reach a point of diminishing returns where additional complexity costs more than it benefits. When stressed, these complex systems can collapse to simpler, more sustainable forms of organization. Historian Arnold Toynbee analyzed the rise and fall of 26 civilizations in his massive study, A Study of History. He concluded that civilizations grow by successfully responding to challenges but decline when their responses become rigid and they can no longer adapt creatively to new challenges. He saw collapse not as external conquest but as internal failure of will and creativity. These patterns of rise and fall, observable in the historical record, lend credence to cyclical theories of history. Civilizations do seem to follow trajectories of growth, florescence, decline, and collapse. The specific causes vary but the pattern recurs. Yet each collapse also demonstrates contingency. Rome fell in the west but survived in the east. Maya cities collapsed in the heartland but continued elsewhere. Civilizations are not doomed to follow an inevitable cycle. Their fates depend on specific circumstances and choices. This raises critical questions for our own civilization. We face environmental stresses including climate change that parallel or exceed those that contributed to past collapses. Our global civilization is unprecedentedly complex and interconnected, potentially more vulnerable to cascading failures. Yet we also possess knowledge and technology that past civilizations lacked, giving us options for adaptation that were previously unavailable. Are we fated to repeat the cycle of rise and fall, or can we learn from past collapses and choose a different path? The answer may depend on whether we can overcome the structural rigidities and short-term thinking that have plagued societies throughout history, transcending the wheel of civilizational rise and fall that has turned for thousands of years. If civilizations rise and fall in cycles, if catastrophes periodically destroy accumulated knowledge and force humanity to begin again, how might ancient peoples have attempted to preserve wisdom for distant future generations? One answer lies in the monuments they built. Massive stone structures designed to endure across millennia, encoding astronomical knowledge, mathematical principles, and perhaps warnings about the cycles of catastrophe and renewal. The Great Pyramid of Giza stands as the most impressive and enigmatic of these monuments. Built during the 4th dynasty of Egypt's Old Kingdom, around 2,560 years before the Common Era, this massive structure consists of approximately 2.3 million stone blocks, each weighing on average 2.5 tons. Though some blocks in the king's chamber weigh up to 80 tons. The pyramid rises 481 feet and was the tallest human-made structure in the world for nearly 4,000 years. What makes the Great Pyramid remarkable is not just its size but its precision. The 4 sides of the base are aligned to the cardinal directions to within 1/15 of a single degree. The base forms an almost perfect square, with sides measuring approximately 756 feet and differing by only a few inches. The angle of the pyramid's slope is precisely measured, and the ratios between the pyramid's dimensions encode mathematical relationships including approximations of pi and phi, the golden ratio. How did the ancient Egyptians achieve such precision with supposedly primitive tools? And why did they invest such enormous resources in constructing this monument? The conventional explanation, that the Great Pyramid was simply a tomb for Pharaoh Khufu, has struck many observers as inadequate. No mummy has ever been found in the Great Pyramid, and while this could be explained by ancient looting, the pyramid's interior contains features that seem poorly designed for a tomb but suggestive of other purposes. The king's chamber contains 4 narrow shafts that extend up through the pyramid's mass at precise angles. For many years, Egyptologists claimed these were ventilation shafts, but recent research has shown they are oriented toward specific stars as they would have appeared when the pyramid was built. The southern shaft from the king's chamber pointed at Alnitak, the lower of Orion's 3 belt stars, while the northern shaft pointed at Alpha Draconis, the pole star of that era. Similar shafts from the lower Queen's chamber pointed at Sirius and the star Kochab in Ursa Minor. These astronomical alignments have led researchers like Robert Bauval to propose that the Great Pyramid served as a kind of stellar temple or astronomical instrument. Bauval's Orion correlation theory suggests that the 3 main Giza pyramids are positioned to mirror the 3 stars of Orion's belt. and that the layout of monuments along the west bank of the Nile corresponds to the position of stars along the Milky Way. Taking this further, Bovell and Graham Hancock have argued that the monuments encode astronomical information about the precession of the equinoxes and preserve knowledge of a much older civilization. They point to the nearby Sphinx, whose leonine form they interpret as representing the constellation Leo. Using astronomical software, they calculated that the Sphinx would have faced directly toward the constellation Leo on the spring equinox around 10,500 years before the Common Era. This date, they argue, might represent when the monuments were originally designed, or perhaps commemorate an important date from an earlier civilization. Geologist Robert Schoch has argued that weathering patterns on the Sphinx suggest it is much older than conventionally believed. The erosion on the Sphinx enclosure walls appears to him to be caused by heavy rainfall over long periods, but Egypt's climate has been arid for the past 5,000 years. This would push the Sphinx's construction back to the wetter conditions that prevailed before around 3,000 years before the Common Era, or possibly even earlier, to the end of the last ice age when rainfall in the region was much greater. These alternative theories remain highly controversial among Egyptologists, who maintain that the pyramids and Sphinx date to the Old Kingdom period based on archaeological context, inscriptions and radiocarbon dating of organic materials from the sites. They argue that the astronomical alignments, while real, can be explained as reflecting the ancient Egyptians' sophisticated astronomy without requiring an earlier civilization. The weathering patterns on the Sphinx, they suggest, could result from other factors including chemical erosion, pooling water and wind-blown sand. Yet even within conventional chronology, the Great Pyramid demonstrates sophisticated knowledge. The descending passage of the pyramid is aligned with extraordinary precision to true north. Its length of exactly 344 feet may encode astronomical information, as this is close to 365.25 cubits, the number of days in a solar year. The king's chamber dimensions, when expressed in royal cubits, form a 1:2 square root 5 triangle, a relationship rich with mathematical significance. The granite sarcophagus in the king's chamber has been measured with modern instruments and found to have sides that are parallel and square to tolerances of a few thousandths of an inch, precision that seems extraordinary for supposedly primitive tools. The chamber itself is constructed from massive granite blocks fitted together so precisely that you cannot insert a knife blade between them. Beyond Giza, other Egyptian monuments demonstrate astronomical knowledge. The Temple of Karnak is aligned to the winter solstice sunrise, and many scholars believe its main axis was periodically adjusted to account for precession. At Abu Simbel, the Temple of Ramesses II is constructed so that twice a year, on specific dates in February and October that may commemorate Ramesses' birthday and coronation, sunlight penetrates deep into the temple to illuminate statues of the gods. These alignments suggest that ancient Egyptian temples were not just religious centers but also astronomical observatories where priest astronomers tracked celestial cycles. The temples encoded in stone the results of long-term astronomical observation, creating permanent records of knowledge that could outlast any written document. This same pattern appears in monuments worldwide. Stonehenge in England, constructed in several phases between 300 and 1500 years before the Common Era, is famous for its alignment to the summer solstice sunrise and winter solstice sunset. But recent research has revealed that Stonehenge also tracks the 18.6-year cycle of the moon's major standstill, when the moon reaches its most extreme rising and setting positions. This suggests that Stonehenge's builders possessed sophisticated knowledge of lunar cycles requiring decades of careful observation. In the Americas, the Maya built numerous structures with astronomical alignments. The Pyramid of Kukulkan at Chichen Itza is designed so that on the spring and autumn equinoxes, the setting sun creates the illusion of a serpent descending the pyramid stairway. At Uxmal, the governor's palace is aligned to the extreme southerly setting position of Venus, a planet of great importance in Maya cosmology. The Nazca lines in Peru, vast geoglyphs etched into the desert floor sometime between 500 years before the Common Era and 500 of the Common Era, include numerous straight lines that extend for miles across the landscape. While their purpose remains debated, some researchers have argued that they may have served astronomical or calendrical functions, perhaps marking sight lines to important celestial events on the horizon. Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, dated to around 9,600 years before the Common Era, features massive T-shaped stone pillars arranged in circular enclosures. The site predates agriculture in the region and was apparently built by hunter-gatherers, which has forced archaeologists to reconsider assumptions about the capabilities of pre-agricultural societies. Recent research has suggested possible astronomical alignments at the site, with some pillars perhaps representing constellations and the site as a whole possibly serving as a kind of Stone Age observatory or astronomical memorial. What unites these disparate monuments across time and space is the encoding of astronomical knowledge in durable form. Unlike written texts, which can be lost or destroyed, unlike oral traditions which can be corrupted or forgotten, stone monuments endure. They serve as a kind of astronomical calendar and textbook, preserving knowledge of celestial cycles that might otherwise be lost. If ancient peoples were aware of the precession of the equinoxes, they would have understood that astronomical knowledge is time-sensitive. The pole star changes over millennia. The constellation rising at the spring equinox gradually shifts. A star catalog accurate in one era becomes obsolete in another. By encoding astronomical alignments in monuments, they could preserve a snapshot of the sky from a particular epoch, allowing future generations to calculate backward or forward through the precessional cycle. Some researchers have gone further, suggesting that monuments may encode warnings about catastrophic cycles. If ancient peoples experienced civilization-ending disasters and wanted to warn their descendants, how would they do so? Written warnings could be lost or mistranslated. But massive stone monuments, aligned to celestial events in ways that obviously required knowledge and effort, might serve as permanent markers, drawing attention to important dates in cosmic cycles when catastrophes recur. Graham Hancock has argued that monuments worldwide encode a date around 10,500 years before the Common Era, which he associates with the end of the last ice age and a hypothetical advanced civilization destroyed by cataclysm. Whether or not this specific claim is correct, the general principle seems sound. Monuments can encode information for the future in forms more durable than any written language. The challenge lies in decoding the monument's messages. What seems like an obvious astronomical alignment to us might be coincidental. What appears random might encode subtle patterns we don't yet recognize. We must be careful not to impose our own preconceptions on ancient monuments, seeing patterns that aren't really there. Yet the sheer number of monuments with clear astronomical alignments, the precision with which they were constructed, and the enormous resources invested in them suggest that ancient peoples were trying to communicate something to the future. Perhaps they understood, in ways we are only beginning to recover, that knowledge is fragile, that civilizations rise and fall, and that what seems permanent can be swept away. By writing in stone and orienting their writings to the eternal stars, they sought to preserve what wisdom they had accumulated for generations yet unborn. These monuments stand as testimony to the ancient understanding of cyclical time, of the vast cosmic rhythms that dwarf human affairs, and of the possibility, perhaps the inevitability, that knowledge must be preserved across the catastrophes that periodically reset human civilization. They are time capsules in the most literal sense, messages from the deep past to the distant future, encoded in the most enduring language available. Massive stone aligned with the stars. Throughout this journey, we have encountered again and again the ancient idea that time is not a line but a circle, that history does not progress steadily forward but moves through repeating cycles of rise and fall, creation and destruction, golden ages and dark ages. This cyclical view of time, expressed in the Hindu Yugas, the Mayan calendar, the Greek ages, and the precession of the equinoxes, stands in stark contrast to the linear, progressive understanding of history that has dominated Western thought for the past few centuries. The philosophical implications of choosing one view over the other are profound, affecting how we understand human nature, the meaning of progress, our relationship to the past, and the possibilities open to the future. The linear view of history, which became dominant in the West largely through the influence of Christianity and later Enlightenment thought, sees time as having a direction and a purpose. In the Christian framework, history moves from creation through the fall to eventual redemption, culminating in the Second Coming and the establishment of God's kingdom. This gives history a plot, a narrative arc with beginning, middle, and end. Human events are not meaningless but participate in this divine drama. The Enlightenment secularized this linear framework while retaining its essential structure. History became a story of progress, moving from ignorance toward knowledge, from superstition toward reason, from tyranny toward liberty. The scientific revolution, the industrial revolution, the spread of democracy, all were understood as steps forward in humanity's inevitable march toward greater enlightenment and improvement. This linear, progressive narrative has enormous psychological and political appeal. It suggests that suffering has meaning, that history is moving toward a goal, that our efforts contribute to something larger than ourselves. It provides hope that the future will be better than the past and that human ingenuity can solve any problem. It justifies confidence in human agency and rationality. But the linear view also has troubling implications that become apparent when we examine actual history. The idea of progress can become a kind of faith, leading us to ignore evidence that things might not be improving in all respects. It can make us dismissive of the past, assuming that because we come later in time we must be more advanced. It can blind us to the possibility of decline, making us unable to recognize when our civilization is failing because we cannot imagine that progress might reverse. The cyclical view, by contrast, recognizes that rise is always followed by fall, that golden ages give way to darker times, that what goes up must come down. This perspective has its own psychological implications. It can lead to fatalism, to the sense that since cycles are inevitable, individual effort doesn't matter. It can discourage attempts at improvement, since whatever we build will eventually crumble. It can produce a conservative, backward-looking culture that venerates the past as a lost golden age that can never be recovered. Yet the cyclical view also offers important correctives to the hubris of linear progress. It encourages humility, reminding us that no civilization is permanent, that our achievements are fragile, that we are not the summit of history but merely one turn of an eternal wheel. It validates the wisdom of the past rather than dismissing it as primitive superstition. It recognizes destruction as part of existence rather than an aberration that progress will eventually eliminate. Perhaps most importantly, the cyclical view can make us aware of patterns that the linear view obscures. If civilizations repeatedly follow similar trajectories of rise and fall, understanding these patterns might help us recognize where our own civilization sits in the cycle and what vulnerabilities we face. The fall of Rome, the collapse of the Maya, the abandonment of Angkor, these are not just historical curiosities but case studies in civilizational failure that might contain lessons for the present. Some modern thinkers have attempted to synthesize linear and cyclical perspectives. Oswald Spengler, in The Decline of the West, argued that civilizations are like organisms, each passing through stages of youth, maturity, and senescence. But he saw these cycles playing out within an overall context of historical development, with each civilization contributing something unique before it passes away. Arnold Toynbee similarly saw civilizations rising and falling in cycles but within an overall framework of spiritual evolution, with each civilization's challenges and responses contributing to humanity's gradual development. The spiral rather than the circle might serve as a better metaphor for this synthesis. Time moves forward, but it also loops back on itself, creating patterns that rhyme even as they never exactly repeat. We face similar challenges to those our ancestors faced: resource depletion, climate change, political instability, the difficulties of maintaining complex social organization. But we face them with different knowledge, technologies, and contexts. History repeats itself, but with variations, creating a spiral of ascent and descent that moves through time rather than simply circling endlessly. The recognition that time might be cyclical rather than linear should affect how we approach the future. If progress is not inevitable, if civilizations can and do fall, then maintaining our civilization requires constant effort and vigilance. We cannot simply assume that problems will be solved by the march of progress. We must actively choose to preserve knowledge, to maintain infrastructure, to address environmental degradation, to resolve social conflicts before they become catastrophic. The cyclical view also suggests we should pay more attention to the wisdom of the past. If ancient peoples experienced similar challenges and developed ways of thinking about them that helped them survive, we might learn from their example. The emphasis in many traditional societies on sustainability, on maintaining balance with the environment, on social cohesion and shared values, these might not be primitive superstitions to be discarded but hard-won wisdom about how to maintain civilization over long periods. Furthermore, if we take seriously the possibility that ancient civilizations might have been more sophisticated than we usually assume, that knowledge might have been lost and must be recovered, this should make us more open to reconsidering archaeological mysteries and challenging conventional historical narratives when evidence warrants. Not every alternative theory is correct, but intellectual humility requires we acknowledge that our understanding of the past is incomplete and subject to revision. The cyclical view also raises profound questions about human nature. If history repeats in cycles, this suggests that human nature itself might be relatively constant. The same drives that led to the fall of Rome, greed, short-term thinking, inability to cooperate in the face of collective threats, remain with us. The same wisdom that allowed some societies to endure for centuries, long-term thinking, social solidarity, respect for natural limits, is still available to us. The question is whether we will choose wisdom over folly, cooperation over conflict, sustainability over exploitation. This choice is not predetermined by cycles. The cyclical view recognizes patterns but does not eliminate agency. Within the larger rhythms of rise and fall, individual and collective choices matter. A civilization facing resource depletion might choose to develop sustainable practices or might choose to intensify exploitation. A society experiencing political stress might choose to address underlying inequities or might choose to double down on oppression. These choices affect whether decline is gradual or catastrophic, whether collapse leads to dark ages or relatively smooth transformation. Perhaps the deepest philosophical implication of cyclical time concerns the meaning of existence itself. In a linear framework, meaning comes from contributing to progress toward an ultimate goal. In a purely cyclical framework without linear progress, meaning might seem harder to find. If everything that rises must fall, if all our works will eventually be dust, why bother? This is the existential challenge posed by cyclical time, and different philosophical traditions have responded to it differently. Hindu philosophy responds by devaluing the material world and the cycles of samsara, viewing liberation from the wheel of rebirth as the ultimate goal. Buddhist thought similarly sees escape from cyclical existence as enlightenment. For these traditions, recognition of time's cyclical nature is not depressing but liberating, showing that attachment to worldly success and achievement is ultimately futile and that true freedom lies beyond the cycles. Other traditions find meaning within the cycles themselves. The Stoics taught that we should focus on virtue and living well in the present moment, accepting that external circumstances including the fate of civilizations are beyond our control. Meaning comes not from the permanence of our achievements but from the quality of our character and actions. The cyclical view might also encourage us to think in terms of legacy and inheritance differently than the progressive view does. In a linear framework, we inherit from the primitive past and bequeath to the more advanced future. In a cyclical framework, we inherit from sophisticated ancestors who may in some ways have exceeded us, and we bequeath to descendants who may face catastrophes that destroy what we build. This should make us more grateful for what we have received and more thoughtful about what we pass on. Ultimately, the choice between linear and cyclical views of time may be less about which is objectively true and more about which provides a more useful framework for navigating existence. Both views capture aspects of reality. Progress is real. We know more than our ancestors, command more powerful technologies, have eliminated some forms of suffering. But so is cyclical pattern. Civilizations do rise and fall, environmental limits do assert themselves, human nature does repeat its follies. A mature philosophy might embrace both linear and cyclical elements, recognizing progress where it genuinely exists while remaining alert to cyclic patterns and the possibility of decline. This would combine the hope and agency encouraged by the linear view with the humility and long-term perspective encouraged by the cyclical view. As we stand at the beginning of the 21st century, facing challenges that include climate change, resource depletion, political polarization, and technological disruption, both perspectives seem necessary. We need the linear faith in human agency and problem-solving to believe that these challenges can be addressed. But we also need the cyclical awareness that civilizations have collapsed before when they failed to address similar challenges, that our current trajectory is not sustainable, and that without deliberate change we risk joining the long list of civilizations that rose to heights only to fall into ruin. The ancient understanding of cyclical time, expressed in the Yugas and the Great Year, in flood myths and fallen civilizations, in monuments aligned to eternal stars, offers not a counsel of despair but a call to awareness. The wheel turns, yes, but we are not passive passengers. Within the cycles we make choices that matter. Recognizing the patterns of history does not doom us to repeat them. It gives us the opportunity to make wiser choices, to learn from the past, and perhaps to transcend the fate that has befallen so many civilizations before us. We have traveled a long distance tonight, through time and space, from ancient Mesopotamia to the present day, from the Sumerian king list to modern archaeological discoveries, from flood myths to fallen civilizations, from monuments aligned with stars to philosophical contemplations on the nature of time itself. Throughout this journey, one theme has recurred: the ancient understanding that time is not a simple forward march but a complex rhythm, a wheel that turns through cycles of creation and destruction, rise and fall, light and darkness. The Sumerian king list, with its division of history into before and after the flood, established a template that would echo through human thought for millennia. The impossibly long reigns of the antediluvian kings suggest a golden age, a time when the world was fundamentally different, when human life exceeded the bounds we now know. The flood that swept away this world became a universal symbol, appearing in myths from every corner of the globe, suggesting either a shared catastrophe in humanity's deep past or a shared human experience of disaster and renewal. The cyclical understanding of time found its most sophisticated expression in the Hindu Yugas, vast cosmic ages spanning millions of years, each progressively more degraded than the last until destruction clears the way for renewal. The Maya similarly conceived of time in terms of great cycles, carefully tracking astronomical movements and encoding their knowledge in monuments and calendars. The Greeks spoke of ages of gold, silver, bronze, and iron, each inferior to what came before. These were not isolated ideas but expressions of a worldview that saw history as fundamentally cyclical. This cyclical framework was linked to astronomical observation, particularly the precession of the equinoxes, that vast 26,000-year wobble of Earth's axis that causes the position of the stars to gradually shift. The discovery of this cycle by Hipparchus represented a remarkable achievement of ancient astronomy, but hints in earlier monuments and texts suggest that knowledge of precession might extend even further back in time, perhaps encoded in the alignments of pyramids and megaliths that sought to preserve astronomical wisdom in stone. The legend of Atlantis, whether historical or purely allegorical, captures the cyclical theme of a golden age destroyed by catastrophe. While we may never know if Atlantis was real, the story resonates because it expresses a truth we can observe in history. Civilizations do rise and fall, knowledge can be lost, catastrophe can strike suddenly and destroy what seemed permanent. The fall of real civilizations, the Indus Valley, the Maya, Rome, Angkor, demonstrates that collapse is not mythical but historical, not something that happened only in ancient times but a recurring pattern throughout human history. These collapses follow patterns. Environmental stress, particularly climate change, appears repeatedly as a contributing factor. Resource depletion, political instability, economic problems, warfare, and disease all play roles. Often, it is not one factor but a combination that overwhelms a civilization's capacity to adapt. Complex societies may be particularly vulnerable, requiring constant inputs of energy and resources to maintain themselves and subject to cascading failures when critical systems break down. Yet understanding these patterns need not lead to fatalism. Each collapse also shows the role of choice and contingency. Civilizations that adapted successfully to changing conditions survived longer. Those that maintained flexibility and avoided rigid adherence to failing strategies fared better. The cycles of history are not iron laws that override human agency but patterns we can learn from and potentially transcend. The monuments ancient peoples built, the pyramids of Egypt and Mesoamerica, Stonehenge, Göbekli Tepe, and countless others, stand as testimonies to their understanding of cyclical time and their attempts to encode knowledge for future generations. By aligning monuments to celestial events and encoding astronomical information in stone, they created time capsules designed to outlast any civilization, preserving knowledge that might otherwise be lost in the catastrophes they perhaps anticipated. What are the implications of all this for us, living in the early 21st century? We stand at a unique moment in human history, possessed of unprecedented technological power and knowledge but also facing challenges that threaten the stability of our global civilization. Climate change, resource depletion, environmental degradation, political polarization, and the risks inherent in advanced technologies all combine to create a situation not unlike those that preceded historical collapses. The linear, progressive narrative that has dominated recent Western thought tells us not to worry, that human ingenuity will solve these problems, that the march of progress continues upward. But the cyclical perspective urges caution. Civilizations have fallen before. Knowledge has been lost. What seems permanent can prove fragile. Without deliberate effort to address the mounting stresses our civilization faces, we risk joining the long list of societies that rose to great heights only to collapse. This is not a prediction of inevitable doom. The cyclical view, properly understood, recognizes that within the larger patterns human choices matter. We can learn from the failures of past civilizations. We can make different choices than they did. We can potentially break the cycle, not by denying that cycles exist but by understanding them well enough to navigate them consciously. Perhaps most importantly, the cyclical view encourages us to think on longer timescales than the linear progressive narrative promotes. Instead of focusing only on quarterly earnings, election cycles, or the technological developments of the next decade, we might consider what kind of world we want to exist in a century, a millennium, 10,000 years from now. Instead of assuming that progress will continue automatically, we might ask what we need to preserve, what knowledge we need to encode, what wisdom we need to recover from ancestors who may have understood things we have forgotten. The ancient understanding of cyclical time also invites us to reconsider our relationship with the past. We need not view our ancestors as primitive precursors to our superiority. They were humans like us, possessing intelligence and wisdom, facing challenges similar to those we face, sometimes succeeding and sometimes failing. Their monuments, their myths, their astronomical knowledge, these are not merely historical curiosities but potential sources of insight for our own time. As you drift toward sleep tonight, consider the vast wheel of time that has turned through all the ages, carrying civilizations up to golden heights and then down into darkness, over and over, in a rhythm as old as the stars. Consider the flood myths preserved by cultures worldwide, the yugas that span millions of years, the great year that takes 26,000 years to complete. Consider the pyramids standing in the desert, aligned with Orion, perhaps encoding messages we have not fully deciphered. Consider the Sumerian king list with its impossible antediluvian rains and its stark marker, then the flood swept over. We are not the first civilization to rise to greatness, and if we fail to learn from the patterns of history, we may not be the last to fall. But we are also not doomed. The wheel turns but we are not passive. Within the cycles there is choice. Understanding the eternal return does not trap us within it. It gives us the perspective to make wiser decisions, to avoid the errors that have felled so many before us, and perhaps to contribute something lasting to the great spiral of human existence. The eternal wheel turns in darkness and in light, through ages of gold and ages of iron, through catastrophe and renewal. It has turned since before history began, and it will turn long after we are gone. But in this moment, in this turn of the wheel, we live and choose and act. And in that choice, within the vast cosmic cycles, lies meaning enough for any human life. Sleep now, knowing that you are part of a story much larger than yourself, a story that extends backward to the first humans who looked up at the stars and forward to descendants we cannot imagine. The wheel turns, but the turning itself is the eternal dance of existence, and we are privileged to participate in it for our brief moment in time. Rest in that knowledge and let the great cycles carry you into dreams,